Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you. I got to tell you, this is my favorite conference. It's my favorite conference because it's an opportunity for me, as well as all the guys in my lab, to interact with the brightest professionals, the brightest practitioners, and the best scientists in the world on a topic we're all passionate about. Today's a very exciting topic, and that's blood flow restriction training and its effects on strength and hypertrophy. And it's exciting not just for its applications, but also because it's controversial. So as a background, if you look at American College of Sports Medicine, they suggest that to increase muscle size or skeletal muscle hypertrophy, you need to select an intensity that is at least 70% of your 1RM and performed at or near failure, which is going to come out to around 8 to 12 repetitions. So this is the suggestion that anything below this intensity is not enough to elicit hypertrophy or gains in muscle. So why do they say this? Well, there are a couple of reasons why. And it comes down to this. If you look here, this is a graph looking at skeletal muscle protein synthesis, or sort of the acute building of muscle. And it's looking at an intensity threshold here. So we have percentage of 1RM, and what you notice is that around 60 to 75% of 1RM, you see a peak in muscle protein synthesis in young and the elderly. So it sort of supports this 70%, 60, 70% threshold. And if you move forward, there's another concept that's known as metabolic stress. And this is very interesting. Essentially, it says that metabolic stress, or increases in lactate in the muscle and hydrogen ions, actually promote growth. So, but the key is that when you train in this 8 to 12 repetition range, 70% range, you need to train near failure. And so what this study is looking at is they have a non-rest condition where they perform sets of 10 repetitions with no rest between repetitions, and then they have a rest condition. Excuse me. Then they have a rest condition. So here's the resting condition, and this is the non-resting condition. In the resting condition, they had rest between reps. So that will lower fatigue between repetitions, right? So if you did, instead of doing a set of 10, you might do a set of 5, 1 minute rest period, and then finish a set of 5. So it lowers the fatigue. Notice that when you have intraset rest periods, you have less growth than when you have no rest. Now, what this is suggesting is that fatigue is important for growth. And if you look inside of the muscle itself, we see lactate levels are in the blood. Lactate levels are higher in the non-rest condition compared to the rest condition. And so is growth. So this is called the metabolic stress theory of growth. And for more information on this, actually Brad Schoenfeld, my good friend, just published a paper in the highest impact journal in our field on how blood flow, or on how metabolic stress might enhance hypertrophy. So I would suggest reading that. Moving forward, this is a study we recently did in our lab that was headed up by Jordan Joy here, and we did that same approach. So we took a group of individuals and had them do 4 sets of 10 at 75% of their 1RM, or we had them basically have intraset rest periods. So they do a set of 5, after 5 reps they rested, and then they finished the set off, right? So they ended up doing like 8 sets of 5 in a sense compared to 4 sets of 10. So they have intraset rest, which would lower fatigue and metabolic stress. We looked at motor unit recruitment, so how much muscle was activated. And what you can see here is this blue group, they have no rest between sets, so they have higher fatigue. Muscle activation, motor unit recruitment's higher in the high fatigue group than the group that had rest between reps. So again, this is suggesting that, again, 70% threshold performed to near failure results in greater muscle activation, greater motor unit recruitment, high amounts of metabolic stress, and protein synthesis being optimized. If we move forward, this is a good paper by Fry, and basically what Fry did was he took several data points from studies and looked at where hypertrophy was optimized on your type 1 and your type 2 fibers. And what you can see is that hypertrophy seems to be optimized at around about 60 to 85% of your 1RM. So this seems to support this hypothesis from ACSM that, hey, you need this threshold intensity to get growth. okay? So basically what's saying is that you need this to lift heavy weights to get this, right? So in order to hypertrophy, you actually need to lift heavy weights. But the bottom line is we know that when you're working with your athletes, there are times where they may be injured, they may be overreached, and they may not have the perceptual recovery to even train high intensity that day. Is there a way we can keep helping them make gains? And that's what we're looking into. We think there are other methods, and that's what this talks about. One alternative method is blood flow restriction training. And what that involves is wrapping a cuff or a wrapping device proximally around the limb. So if it's the arms, it would be right here. If it's the thighs, it would be here. And what it does, it restricts blood flow towards the muscle, and you train. So it's called blood flow restriction training. But the thing about it is, think about it. If you're restricting flow to the muscle, you're not going to be able to lift very heavy. And in fact, in these studies, we're having individuals lift at 20 to 30% of their 1RM, right? Okay, so let's look at what happens. Jeremy Lineke and I just recently published a meta-analysis on blood flow restriction training. So what we did was we compared low intensity, like 20 to 30% 1RM, to low intensity with blood flow restriction. So basically, what you have here, what we're showing here is that these are each individual data points on skeletal muscle hypertrophy. So you have hypertrophy here on the vertical axis. When you perform 20 to 30% of your 1RM, you get no hypertrophy. Well, no surprise, right? If you wouldn't expect to train 20 to 30% of your 1RM and see a lot of growth. You wrap the limb, you blood flow restrict, look what happens. Hypertrophy. So it's performing 20 to 30% of your 1RM, you wrap the limb and you're getting hypertrophy. Now this is exciting stuff, right? So what we want to know is, and here's the other thing. I mean, how many of you go to the gym and you walk on the treadmill and think, oh, I'm going to grow, I'm going to get big and strong? It never crosses your mind, okay? In this study by Abe, they wrapped the limbs and they walked. And what you can see, here's the walking group, control group. When you blood flow restricted, they increase skeletal muscle hypertrophy. That's crazy, right? You're walking and you're getting gains in muscle size and strength. That's amazing. So what we want to know is this: what in the world is going on, right? Why is this happening? What are the mechanisms of action? So we got to understand that first before we can bridge the gap, right? So what are the mechanisms of action? Well, there are a couple different mechanisms. The first is motor unit recruitment. So, in order to grow, in order to get stronger, you need to recruit the higher threshold motor units, your fast twitch, your type 2 fibers. So if you look at this graph here, if you're training 30% of your 1RM, you're going to recruit the type 1 smaller muscle fibers. You're not going to hypertrophy. But if you blood flow restrict, what happens is you're restricting flow of the limb. You have high metabolic stress, like a bunch of lactate building up. So your slow twitch fibers fatigue out quickly, but you got to keep maintaining the load. So how do you do that? You recruit the fast twitch type 2 fibers. So motor unit recruitment's up. Is there data to support this? Yeah. So look at this right here. This study is looking at electromyography, so you're looking at muscle activation here. And what you have here, this is muscle activation at 80% of your 1RM, and this 40% of your 1RM. Well, it makes sense that muscle activation is higher with 80% of your 1RM, right? But if you restrict flow, you can see to the right side of the graph that you actually have comparable activation. And so that's very interesting. Now, one of the questions, so in other words, you're recruiting muscle to around close to the same extent. The other thing that I really want to point out to you guys actually about this slide is, look at the metabolic stress. This is blood lactate levels. They're performing it at 40% of their 1RM, and blood lactate is greater than 80% of your 1RM. So metabolic stress is very high. Motor unit recruitment is comparable. One of the questions we get in our lab all the time is people go, oh, okay, well, you can restrict the arms, you can restrict the legs, but that's not going to make your chest grow, right? It's not going to make your glutes respond. right? So that's what one of the questions we commonly get. Well, here's the crazy thing. If you restrict the arms, your chest actually grows. It's amazing. So look at this. This is EMG data here, okay? So what we see here is muscle activation, and what you can see here, this is the pecs, pectoralis major. So this is muscle activation in the control group of the pecs. When you occlude, look what happens. Look how much greater muscle activation is in the pecs. That's crazy. So actually, and also we see the same thing in the glutes. So if you're restricting up here and you're doing squats, your glutes have greater activation. And one of the things Ryan Lowry in my lab points out a lot of times is this. He goes, well, it makes sense. Think about it. Strategically, your nervous system, if your muscle fibers are fatiguing out here and you have to maintain the load, it's going to recruit higher threshold motor units, the larger muscle fibers in your chest muscles. Same thing with your glutes. So the great thing about this is very versatile. I talked to an athlete with a pec strain, one of the top athletes in the world with a pec strain. Perfect for him right now in this situation, okay? He can keep going. Okay, now, you know when we train, after the gym, we kind of feel like this, right? Feel like the Hulk. And, guys, bodybuilders, trainers, they like that feeling. They get this huge pump when they train, right? And intuitively, we think, well, maybe this is anabolic. Of course, 2 hours later, you're kind of back down to baseline, right? So, but anyway, is there something to what we call cell swelling? Is there something with cell swelling? Well, this is actually, Brad Schoenfeld does a really good job in his paper, and also last year when he talking about cell swelling theory. And what Brad sort of suggested was this. What happens is with blood flow restriction, you're restricting venous but not arterial flow. And I'm going to come back to that, but that's critical. You restrict venous but not arterial flow. That means blood is flowing to the muscle but not away. And what happens is you get a shift of fluid from the plasma to the muscle, and it swells. Okay, and what happens is the cell senses a threat to its integrity, so it restructures its architectural network, and it gets bigger. You actually have pressure. So one of the things we think is going on is that swelling is activating things like protein synthesis and upregulating genes that are important for muscle size. So this is really interesting. Now, this is some data. This is a picture from our lab here, and we're looking at part of the quadriceps here. So if you look at the quadriceps, here, this is the muscle is about 4.42 centimeters, okay? You can see that we're measuring here. Now, after, what you're going to do is, this is what happens to the muscle after we put them through blood flow restriction, acutely. Watch this swelling response. So you go 4.42, and then look, 5.16 centimeters. So look at the swelling on this. It's insane. You go 4.42, 5.16. I also want you to notice another thing. Watch this. If you look at the first picture, it's darker. Excuse me. If you look at the first picture, it's darker. Okay? When you watch the brightness effect here, it'll get brighter. That brightness, that signal intensity, we quantify as actually fluid shift in the muscle. So you're actually getting a fluid shift from the plasma to the muscle, so it swells. Lastly, we have metabolic stress, which I talked about again. If you restrict blood flow, you're going to get a large amount of metabolic stress, because if you have low O2, glucose, the final product, is going to be more likely to be lactate, right? And so you're going to produce a lot of lactate. You're going to have an increase in hydrogen ions. And so what we think is that this increase in lactate and hydrogen ions can stimulate things like protein synthesis, maybe inhibit negative regulators of growth like myostatin, and upregulate things like heat shock proteins. But the point is that this metabolic stress enhances growth. This is a study from my colleague David Gunderman. And Gunderman, look at this. He does a study where he does 8 sets of 10 repetitions at 70% of individuals 1RM. That's a fairly good training stimulus. Okay, so 8 sets of 10 repetitions, 70% 1RM. Then he does 20% of the 1RM with blood flow restriction. Okay, for 30 reps, then 15, 15, 15. 20%. compared to 70%. Watch this. This is blood lactate levels after blood flow restriction with 20% compared to the high-intensity condition. That's crazy, 20% of your 1RM. And one thing to point out is this, that lactate is pulling in the muscle, okay, in the blood flow restriction, where it's being cleared in the high-intensity condition, okay? Now, here's something really neat. This is a study by Takata, and they correlated increase in acidity in the muscle. So you have an increase in acidity in the muscle, so you have an increase in lactate, increase in acidity in the muscle, and they correlated it to increases in size. Look at this. The greater the acidity, the greater the increase in hydrogen ions in the muscle, the greater the growth individuals experience. And the same thing with strength. The greater the acidity in the muscle, the greater the growth they experience. So it's suggesting that this metabolic stress causes adaptation. Now look at this. Why is this occurring? And this is where it gets really interesting. So going back to my colleague David Gunderman, he took muscle cells and he cultured them. He cultured muscle cells and he bathed them in lactate, right? So we produce a lot of lactate when we train. He bathed the cells in lactate and he looked at regulators of protein synthesis. And look at this. So this is when you have lactate and this is when you don't. These are all drivers of protein synthesis, which drives muscle building. So you can see here, the black group's the lactate. It's by itself, exposing cells to lactate's activating growth. Think about that. Because from a practitioner standpoint, we can manipulate that. And that's the point. So how's this occurring? Well, we know our stored form of carbohydrate is glycogen. Okay? So glycogen eventually gets converted early on into glucose 6-phosphate, and I want you to see that. It's very important. So glycogen gets broken down and it can convert to glucose 6-phosphate. If you take glucose into the cell, you will phosphorylate it and convert it to glucose 6-phosphate. Okay? Now, this eventually gets converted to fructose, and then fructose 1,6-biphosphate. But the point is this. This metabolic pathway of glycolysis, how we extract energy from glucose, is very important. And in any metabolic pathway, you have what we call rate-limiting enzymes. So rate-limiting enzymes control the rate that a pathway goes. If you inhibit those rate-limiting enzymes, you put the brakes on the pathway. Okay? So what happens is this. Lactate actually puts the brakes on the rate-limiting enzymes of glycolysis. So it comes in, it impairs further breakdown of glucose 6-phosphate. And glucose 6-phosphate is known to stimulate by itself protein synthesis. So you have an accumulation of this glucose 6-phosphate in the muscle. And it's stimulated by an increase in lactate. And then we have growth. But does it work in blood flow restriction? This study here, you have high-intensity training is the white group. Then you have blood flow restriction, and that's the black group. Look at glucose 6-phosphate in the muscle. The black group, it's drastically rising, okay? So again, what I want to do is I want to summarize this up. This is a lot of information, okay? When you blood flow restrict, you increase motor unit recruitment, somewhat comparable to high-intensity training, okay? So you're activating the higher threshold motor units and muscle fibers. You have high amounts of metabolic stress, greater than any form of exercise that we've seen. High amounts of metabolic stress. Then we have an increase in cell swelling, which seems to activate growth, and ultimately all these lead to increase in protein synthesis and muscle growth. But you want to know something? That's great, but this is the National Strength and Conditioning Association, okay? And we as an organization are the #1 organization in the world for bridging the gap between science and application. That has always been our MO. That's what will always separate us from everyone else. So the rest of this presentation is going to do just that. We're going to bridge the gap between this science and application. So I'll start with a story. It was Christmas, and it was 2008. I went home, and my brother Gabriel Wilson, now Dr. Wilson, he gave me for Christmas knee wraps. Now, I had read about blood flow restriction training before, and I thought it was awesome, but I never tried it. So he gave me knee wraps. I'm like, Gabe, why do I need knee wraps? I don't need them, right? So he goes, no, Jake, they're for blood flow restriction, okay? So anyway, this is the first time that I ever used it. And So I got this, the first time I experienced it, I got this huge pump in my arms, and I was like, this is crazy. I got to do research on this. So basically, our lab, for the last several years, has looked at how to optimize this stimulus. And what we've looked at is what's the best exercise mode, what's the volume, what device should you use, how frequently should you do this, what's the best type of contraction to elicit this growth response. And that's what we're going to take you through. And yes, I do like Metallica. So, okay, moving on. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about modality, okay? So modality is basically what you're using. We know walking increases growth, and we also know that weight training increases growth, okay? So basically, what Jeremy Linick and I did was we compared the effects of walking compared to weight training with blood flow restriction. So you see the growth response, and what we found was here that walking increases growth moderately, but weight training, you have a large increase in growth. So walking can get you to grow, it can get you to get stronger too, but weight training is still going to be the optimal stimulus. But you might walk sometimes if the athlete can't train. If their range of motion is impaired, they can use this, right? So it can be used for a progression model. The next thing that we looked at was frequency. So what we did was we looked at 2 to 3 days per week versus 4 to 5 days a week versus 6 to 7 days per week. And you can clearly see here that you get the greatest gains around 2 to 3 times a week using this stimulus. So when you're using blood flow restriction, you will use it about 2 to 3 times a week is what we found. Okay? It's about 2 to 3 times a week. Moving forward, we looked at rest periods. Now I'll be honest with you, rest periods we have to look a lot more into. What's the ideal rest period between sets? So we looked at 30 versus 60 seconds, and you actually see greater gains when you did 30 seconds compared to 60 seconds. And you go, why is that happening? Well, here's the thing. When you're blood flow restricting, normally when you train and you rest between sets, you're getting relief. You're getting no relief here because the lactate is and all the metabolites are pulling in your muscle. It only gets harder if you rest longer. So basically you rest 30 seconds, and you pump out more reps, okay? So in this stimulus, 30 seconds is probably ideal, okay? So that's kind of an interesting thing. The next thing that we were interested in is what about contraction type? Now, we know, actually, we're doing a lot of research in our lab. It's one of Jordan Joy's favorite topics on what's called mechanotransduction. And basically what we see is this. When you do a lift, a lot of the mechanical stimulus is on the eccentric lowering portion of the lift, right? That's where you cause a lot of the muscle damage, and that's where you release a lot of growth factors. So when you do eccentric versus concentric, you actually get greater protein synthesis with, and I underline this, traditional training. With traditional training, you have greater stimulus with eccentric than concentric contraction. But the thing to understand is, blood flow restriction is not working ideally because of muscle damage and mechanical stimulus. You're at 20% of your 1RM. The mechanical stimulus is not the primary driver of protein synthesis. So what Jeremy Linick did here is he looked at the cell swelling response with concentric versus eccentric contractions. The black is the concentric. The white is the eccentric. Notice that you have greater swelling acutely in the concentric than eccentric. And you also have greater metabolic stress. If we move forward to growth, this is growth. They did several weeks of training with concentric versus eccentric blood flow restriction. So notice here you have more growth. You have growth in the concentric, but none in the eccentric group. Because you're not going to get a mechanical stimulation with 20% of your 1RM if you're doing it eccentrically. It's not going to be, unless you're completely untrained. Okay, so that's very important to understand that this concentric load is actually causing a lot of the metabolic stress that we see. Okay, so also you look at motor unit recruitment, how much muscles activate it. Concentric, way higher muscle activation than eccentric. So this portion of the lift, this raising portion of the lift, pumping those reps out, seems to be very important as opposed to, oh, I'm going to control it really slowly on the way down. not with blood flow restriction. You pump the reps out because we're trying to build up metabolic stress. Now, one of the things is, your athletes. What the biggest thing with athletes is this, and it's for myself too. We think, hey man, if a little is good, more is better, okay? So if you're going to go blood flow restrict, I'm going to restrict as hard as possible, right? I mean, I'm going to restrict so there's no flow to my muscle because that's going to make me grow. So that's kind of what people think, but you don't want to do that, okay? I will have to emphasize this. We're trying to restrict venous, but not arterial flow. You want blood to flow to the muscle to get swelling. You don't want to cut that flow off. You want blood to flow to the muscle, but not escape it. So cut off the venous, but not arterial flow. So you don't want to cut off too tight. Now, what determines whether you get arterial restriction? What determines that? Right? We don't want arterial, we just want venous. So what's the best way to do this? Well, one of the things that determines this is the width of your cuff. Okay, so if you're using a blood pressure cuff, and I'll explain another method we use in our lab, but if you're using a blood pressure cuff, the main device that originally was used in the literature is 5 centimeters. There's another device, the Hokinson, which is 13 centimeters. Now here's what I want you to notice. This study is looking at what blood pressure, at what pressure on the cuff do you get arterial restriction, what we don't want, okay? The wide cuff, you're getting arterial restriction at about 145 millimeters of mercury. 145 millimeters of mercury pressure. Whereas if you use the 5 centimeter cuff, it takes like 240 millimeters of mercury. So the safest way to do this is to use a thinner cuff, 5 to 7 centimeters. You don't want a large cuff, okay? And I'll tell you why. Because there's a greater probability of restricting the arteries. You don't want that. This study here, this was before this data was known, they had 230 millimeters of mercury. Remember, you restrict at 140 with a wide cuff? They used 230 millimeters of mercury in a wide cuff. They restricted arteries a long time ago, okay? So watch this. This is muscle growth here, okay, along the limb. This is the place where they wrapped. Growth was impaired where they wrapped. And the reason why is because we're restricting the arteries. So you will actually impair that response if you restrict the arteries. You just want to restrict the veins. And I have to emphasize that, right? So basically, and also one thing I want to point out is you get more repetitions. This study here by Lineker is comparing wide cuff versus a narrow cuff. You get more total repetitions and therefore more metabolic stress with a narrow cuff than a wide cuff. Okay, so you're getting more total volume with a narrow cuff than a wide cuff. The other thing is that the blood pressure response is very low with a narrow cuff, but it increases with a wide cuff. So you have a greater blood pressure response with a wide cuff. So the take-home message, don't use a wide cuff. Use a cuff that's around 5 to 7 centimeters when you do this. Okay? Okay, now here's the thing. I told you about the Katsu device, right? Now, it's fine. For my lab, this is great, all right? And in fact, right now, Ryan Lowry in my lab just priced the Hokinson, which is another device, $24,000. Okay? How many guys in the gym are going to go pay $24,000 for one of these? Right? So basically, the response is, right, I can't afford that, right? So what do? We got to make this practical. You got to make this so your athletes can use this. So what our lab has been focusing on is what we call practical blood flow restriction. Our lab and also Jeremy Lineker. So what we use is knee wraps. And you wrap proximally around the limb here. And you might do, for example, a leg extension. Now these knee wraps are around 6 to 7 centimeters. They cost 10 to 15 bucks. Okay? So this is what we've been using in our lab. But here's the thing. The problem is that when you're using knee wraps, and this is an example of blood flow restriction. Here on my arms, I ended up putting elbow wraps. Because the knee wraps are really large. So if your arms are smaller, you can use elbow wraps. So this is an example of what you might do for the arms here. Okay? Now here's the thing. With an athlete, how do you know if they're not restricting the arteries? With wraps. In our lab, we can use ultrasound like this. We can look at the veins, and we can look at the arteries in real time, okay? But an athlete's not going to do that, right? So how do you know that they're not restricting the arteries? This is what we've been trying to figure out. So actually, Ryan Lowry's been doing a lot of work on this and in our lab. And what we did was this. This is venous flow and arterial flow with no wrap. What we did was we had athletes wrap on perceived pressure. So we said a 10 out of 10 is the tightest you could wrap. And so what we did was we had them wrap at a moderate pressure, which was a 7 out of 10. And look what we found. You have the artery, but not the vein. So when you wrap at a moderate pressure, and this was everyone in our study. You wrap 7 out of 10, and they had venous, but not arterial restriction. Look, what do you think happened when they wrapped as tight as they could? You can see right here, we said wrap at 10 out of 10, like a lot of guys might do in the gym, nothing. So you don't want to wrap too tight. So you want a 7 out of 10. Ryan Lowry right now is establishing a really intense perceived pressure scale for strength coaches to use. So you'll see that at next year's conference. But for now, what we would say is wrap straight around. You don't want to wrap all the way down because it becomes a wide cuff. Wrap directly around the limb at a perceived pressure of the athlete around 7 out of 10. The other question people have is, well, should I take the wraps off between sets, or should I leave them on? So this is a study that Jeremy Lineker did, where he looked at wrapping between sets, basically taking the wraps off between sets, okay? And basically what he finds in this study, this is the occlusion group, or blood flow restriction. They take the wraps off between sets compared to the control. There's no significant increase in metabolic stress. So blood lactate levels don't even go up when you unwrap between sets because you're allowing it to be cleared. You're defeating the purpose. So the point is keep the wraps on between sets. And in the literature in our lab, our protocol has been about 20 to 30% of your 1RM, and you use 30 reps and then 3 sets of 15. That's been the stimulus in the literature and what we found to be efficacious. But you keep those wraps on the whole time. That's important. Okay, so bottom line is, we wanted to find out was, does what we call practical blood flow restriction actually work? Because we know the $10,000 machine works, but does this work? Can I tell you that? So first study we did, this just got published in Journal of Strength Conditioning Research. We took 12 resistance-trained males, and we looked at the acute determinants of hypertrophy, cell swelling, and metabolic stress, and motor unit recruitment. So we used the wrapping device, and we had them wrap 7 out of 10, and we verified the venous flow was cut off, but not arterial, with ultrasound. So look at this. So here's control. They're just doing, at the beginning, they're doing 15 reps with a low load. Then on the last set of the exercise, this is the control group with no blood flow restriction. This is the blood flow restriction. This is muscle activation using electromyography. Notice that you're recruiting more muscle when you use practical blood flow restriction. So it works. You're recruiting more muscle. We looked at blood lactate levels, and you can see here, blood lactate goes up a little in the control. It skyrockets here in the practical blood flow restriction protocol. So metabolic stress is much higher in the practical blood flow restriction. So it works, which is great. Cell swelling, this is our ultrasound. So this is basically the control. You're not going to see anything at 20 to 30% of your 1RM. But when you blood flow restrict, you see robust increases in the swelling response. So these acute determinants of hypertrophy are elevated, is the point. So that's great. Acutely, you see hypertrophy, right? But does it actually work long term? So this is a paper that we just finished. Ryan Lowry's actually getting ready to submit this. But we did, we looked at how practical blood flow restriction works. If you wrap the limb, what happens? And so we took 24 resistance-trained males. We actually did a diet control on this one. And the cool thing about this study is we had a really unique design. So we took guys, this is just an arm training protocol. And one group trained high intensity the first 4 weeks, and then they switched over the next 4 weeks and did blood flow restriction. The other group started off the first 4 weeks with blood flow restriction, and then they moved over to high intensity. So we wanted to see what happened. We also controlled for total volume. So you can see here that basically they both increase in muscle thickness from pre to mid to 4 weeks, but there's no differences between conditions. And from 4 to 8 weeks, they increase in muscle size, but there's no difference between conditions. So this high-intensity resistance training, this is low-intensity blood flow restriction. So it's increasing growth comparable to high-intensity training is the point. And so practical blood flow restriction, we say scientifically, is something that you guys can use. And that's why we've been doing this. This sort of to bridge the gap. Okay, last thing, or one of the last things I sort of want to talk about is, well, basically, what happens if you compare high-intensity training to blood flow restriction training in terms of protein synthesis? You know? And this is really, really cool, real interesting data from Gunderman. So look at this. This is baseline phosphorylation of mTOR. mTOR regulates protein synthesis. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of mTOR. So if this goes up, protein synthesis usually goes up. And so you can see here, the blood flow restricted group, they did 20% of their 1RM. The high intensity group, 8 sets of 10, 70% 1RM. You have a greater response in this protein signaling with the blood flow restriction. So it's causing robust increases in protein synthesis. But I want to point something out that's very unique to blood flow restriction exercise. Typically with high-intensity resistance training, you typically hypertrophy the type 2 with not as much type 1 hypertrophy. So you get a lot of type 2, but not as much type 1 hypertrophy. With blood flow restriction, you get a large increase in both type 1 and type 2 hypertrophy, and you get increase in protein synthesis in type 1 and type 2 fibers, your slow and fast twitch. That's unique. It's very unique, so it's actually stimulating growth in all of the fibers. Okay, it's sort of more unequal in the high intensity. Now, why is that important? Well, we have our elderly athletes, okay? And this ability to recruit the slow twitch muscle fibers and cause them to grow could be essential for this person right here. Just absolutely essential. And I'll tell you why. Remember when an elderly individual trains, they have a blunted response to training. In my graduate work, we did a lot of stuff with elderly versus young individuals, and you see a blunted response. They can grow, they can respond, but not as well as young. Look at this protein synthesis here. This is elderly response compared to young. It is blunted. We see a blunted response. But when you look here, 2 independent studies by the same group, this is protein synthesis following blood flow restriction in the young and the elderly. The response is not blunted. The elderly are stimulating as much protein synthesis as the young are. And here's why. When we get older, when we have more elderly individuals lose a lot of their type 2 fibers. So it becomes more important for them to actually recruit or actually stimulate growth in the type 1 fibers. So this is very unique to them as far as practical applications. Okay, a couple special scenarios I'm going to run through quickly with you. Bed-rested, injured individuals. There's studies showing that if you are bed-rested, that wrapping, or think about an athlete who's casted. You guys have all seen it. The atrophy is insane. This study here, they were bed-rested, and they intermittently wrapped. No exercise, no movement. They wrapped, and they had intermittently for 5 minutes with 3 minutes rest between. It blunted atrophy. They didn't lose as much muscle. Think about that for an athlete. You don't get the same atrophy. So when they can come back, they're able to train harder. Okay? When they can start to walk, you do it blood flow restricted. Then if they can only lift 20% of their 1RM, you do it blood flow restricted. Now, by the time they can train high intensity, they have good hypertrophy and good muscle size, instead of going through the normal rehab process here and having severe atrophy. So this, I'll be honest with you, I hope a lot of you guys take this and do research on it, because we need a lot of work in this area. Right now we have some case studies. So we did a case study. on rehabilitation of an osteochondral fracture. So what we did was he was a bodybuilder, and while he was squatting, he noticed pain. He went to the doctor, and the doctor took an MRI, and he had an osteochondral fracture. And he said, this requires surgery. You cannot train high intensity. Can't do anything high intensity for the next several weeks. He said, I got to prep for this bodybuilding contest. So what can he do? So what we ended up doing is whatever the doctor said he could do as far as low intensity, we did it blood flow restricted, okay? He came back after his contest, and 30 days after blood flow restriction, the injury had begun to heal itself, and the doctor said, you don't need surgery. This is interesting stuff. Right now, what we're doing in our lab is we're looking at E-stim combined with blood flow restriction, and we're seeing if it augments sort of a response. So this data we'll have for you at next year's NSCA conference. But really interesting sort of concepts that, guys, if you do studies on this, it's going to be really breakthrough. All right, bottom line is sum this up with some practical applications. Okay, for the athlete, I mean, take a star athlete like Adrian Peterson, for example. He gets battered and bruised. You count on him every single week, and by the end of a game, he's hurt. Monday morning, it's hard for him to move probably. So is it best to do super high intensity training then? Well, maybe what you can do on that day is blood flow restriction. Or what if you have guys who are traveling a lot? Or you have less access to equipment. Like if we come here and there's not so good a gym, what do? You know, so an athlete is able to sort of use blood flow restriction in those cases. Remember, use it as part of a periodized split. I am not saying either or. I'm saying use it as a periodized split. Use it correctly. For the elderly, it can be beneficial, okay? And also for our injured athletes, this may be a great tool to prevent atrophy and get them back on the field faster. We've all dealt with this, okay? Use elastic knee wraps around 6 to 7 centimeters, wrap at a pressure around 6 to 7 out of 10 around the limb. If someone's untrained, they might begin with walking, then progress to isolation movements. If someone is trained, I would get them used to it with isolation movements like leg extensions, leg curls, and progress to compound movements so we hit the trunk muscles. Train at a frequency around 2 to 3 times per week. For the injured athlete, if they can't use their limb, intermittently wrap for 5-minute applications with 1 minute rest between applications. The athlete's going to love you because they're not going to get the same atrophy. Then progress to blood flow restricted walking, then blood flow restricted lifting, and then they can go to high intensity. Use this as part of a periodized split, okay? For example, we're still trying to figure this out, but it seems to be able to be used well on a hypertrophy day. Use it on a hypertrophy day. You can use it as a standalone or as a burnout, okay? It could also be used when you're purposefully deloading your athletes. Instead of them going down in strength, they can actually maintain or go up in strength as part of a deload. Okay, here's the thing. My acknowledgments are always long, and I'll tell you why, because you cannot do research without an awesome team. So I want to thank all my guys here. Okay, so Ryan Lowry here is doing a ton of research. He just presented on this. Jordan Joy's doing a ton of research. Josh Dudek, Sean McCleary. Actually, I put Ryan Lowry as a co-author on this presentation because we worked together on this one extensively. Nate Cart, as well as Steve Weiner. So these guys are in the lab 24/7, busting their behind, trying to figure out how to bridge the gap between science and application. I want to thank Brad. If you want to know more about blood flow restriction, read this paper. It just came out. Also want to congratulate him. He's an NSCA fellow now. Okay. I want to thank Drs. Lee Brown, Bill Kramer, Jeff Stout. These guys are my mentors. Sean Wells and Robert Wildman. I have a picture of them on the next slide. These guys are the most phenomenal people in the world, and they help us with our research constantly. Bill Campbell. Jordan Moon has helped us tremendously in our lab by showing us techniques to sensitively measure hypertrophy. And Ray Jackson here, that he was a standard when I was coming up, so he's doing great things. This is Sean Wells, Rob Wildman. Steve Hertzler, we're great friends, and every time I have a study, I can run it by him, and so he's been a great collaborator of our lab. And this is the guy who founded blood flow restriction. So, guys, thank you very much. I know we don't have much time, but any questions?